All right, good morning and happy Father's Day. I didn't know that Father's Day was an international holiday, but as we were asking folks this morning, or in the Zoom meeting here, and there's quite a few people from in the meeting this morning that are from around the world, that in Europe and in Asia and in the Pacific, and so that everybody is celebrating Father's Day today. So that's wonderful. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm going to share a little bit, some thoughts, and then we're going to share some things that we learned from our father or a father figure that was really positive and that has stuck with us. A lesson or a principle or just something that they modeled that really stuck with us throughout our lives. Parents are probably the most impactful people in our lives, and so as we celebrating Father's Day today, we're going to talk about fathers and fatherhood, and the design that God had for fathers was for fathers to be a leader, to have a tremendous positive impact on their families, to love their families and to help their children to grow into the image of God. So what I want to do, so we'll get to some sharings here in a few minutes, but take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 22. I want to show you something kind of interesting this morning. Matthew chapter 22. Let's see, so we got, there we go. And down in verse 36, verse 35, one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing Jesus. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the foremost commandment. And actually, I just realized that I'm not using the one that I wanted to use, because it actually, in a different gospel, it starts off with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. And then you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And this is the great and foremost commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So I don't know if you've ever gone and looked where this commandment comes from. You could actually pull it probably from several places in the law, but certainly Deuteronomy 6. Let's go there. Deuteronomy 6 is basically where Jesus is quoting from. Again, this is not the only place where in the law where you're going to find this sort of thing, but this is clearly what he was quoting. Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4 says, hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So this is, where Jesus is getting the greatest commandment from. But what I want to show you is, if you keep reading, you get something a little interesting. These words, which I am commanding you today, shall be on your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your sons, which would be sons and daughters, to your sons and daughters, and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you walk on the road, when you lie down and when you get up. You shall also tie them as a sign to your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall also write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So he says this greatest commandment, but the greatest commandment is followed by a commandment, right? About the greatest commandment, where he says, these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your children. So we're actually commanded as parents, if you're a parent, to diligently teach them to your children. We're to diligently, certainly in this case, to diligently teach our children to love God, and to love God with all of our being. And so, there's a number of scriptures that you could go through. We're just going to go to one, but all throughout the scriptures, there's encouragement, there's commandment for parents to teach their children, to raise them up in the Lord, to discipline them in the Lord. Proverbs is the book in the Bible written to children, and it's written from a parent to a child, or at least parts of it, and it's designed to help them to grow up into the image of God. And so there's all this stuff in the scriptures about this. This is a big deal for parents, for fathers, certainly, that we have a responsibility. But here's one of the interesting things for those of you who might be a little bit older, is that there's no word for grandfather like there is in English and maybe in some of the other languages spoken here, where we have a specific word that means a person who has children of children. We even have a phrase for someone who has children of children of children, which is a great grandfather. But in the Bible, it's just fathers, right? That's all it is. It's just fathers, right? And there's actually, if we back up a little bit here in Deuteronomy 6, we'll see. I'll just start in verse 1. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgment which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, so that you may do them in the land where you're going over to take possession of it, so that you, your son, and your grandson will fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you. So the idea is that you have a responsibility, if you're a grandparent, to teach your grandchildren to love the Lord God. And I don't know about in other societies around the world. Hopefully this is not the case in where you live, but in the U.S. we have a lot of grandparents today that really are not very involved with their grandchildren. People move across the United States and different places, and grandparents will move away from their children and grandchildren, maybe to Florida for
the other
more than half the year, or the children move away with the grandchildren to some other part of the country, and the grandparents aren't very involved. And sometimes it's by choice of the grandparents; they're just not involved, and sometimes it's not by their choice. But we don't really have that closeness of grandparents and grandchildren in a lot of cases here in the United States that we certainly used to, and hopefully in some other places you do have that. But grandparents have a commandment from God to help their children to rise up into being in the image of God, that they're a follower of Christ, that they obey the commandments of God. Turn to Ephesians. This is the other place we'll look at, and then we'll get to our stories of influence by our fathers. Ephesians in chapter 6, it has a little thing here at verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right? Honor your father and mother, that kind of good stuff. But one thing that you should know, the chapter break between 5 and 6 is not a very good chapter break, because we're still in the context of chapter 5, verse 20 and 21, where it says, always giving thanks for all things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to our God and Father, and submit yourselves to one another in the fear of Christ. So Paul sort of introduces this submitting to one another, and then he gives a whole series of addresses to different kinds of people in submitting. And so he begins with wives submitting to their husbands. Then he talks about husbands, love your wives. This is how a husband submits to his wife, by loving her as Christ loved the church. Then it gets into chapter 6, where it talks about children submitting to their parents. And then interestingly, it has a thing for fathers, which really would be parents, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then it gets into slaves and masters. So he's giving these examples from everyday life in how the church, the body, the brothers and sisters are supposed to be submitting to each other. Think about it in terms of wives submitting to their husbands loving their wives, children obeying their parents, parents treating their children with respect, slaves obeying their masters treating their slaves as brothers and sisters. And so we have this verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So the first thing you should know is, in a lot of languages, this is certainly true for Greek. If you're familiar with Spanish, for instance, this is true of Spanish, where the word for parents is just the plural word for father. So if you're going to say parents in Spanish, padres, right? This was true in Greek. So the Greek word for father is pater, and if you're going to say the plural, it's pateres, and so you get, if you want to say parents, you say pateres, and so there's not a difference in there. So this is the word pateres. So it certainly would be addressed to fathers, but mothers, it's also addressed to you. So fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So here we have a commandment in the New Testament to fathers to bring up their children. So we as fathers have a commandment from the Lord to instruct our children and discipline our children in the Lord, to bring them up again into the image of Christ, ultimately the image of God. And so we have this commandment. But again, I don't want to leave the grandparents out. This applies to grandparents too. That word fathers, that includes grandparents. So if you're a grandfather, you also have a commandment from the Lord to help raise your grandchildren in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I think that's something that every grandparent needs to hear and understand, that when you stand before Christ, if you're a father, when you stand before Christ, you're going to be answering for, did you follow this commandment? Did you do this? But if you're a grandparent, a grandfather, you're also going to be answering, did you obey this commandment, right? We need to do that, right? It's not optional. If you're a parent, you have this responsibility. If you're a grandfather, you have this responsibility. And so we need to take it seriously. And it's because even if you have a really bad parent, right? Maybe a really bad mother or a really bad father, or a grandfather who just, is maybe a drunk or something like that, right? Even if you have a really bad parent, they have tremendous influence on you as a child growing up, even if you've never met them. Think about that for a minute. Even if you've never met your father, they have a tremendous influence. They leave a hole and a gap in your life that affects you for your whole life. If you lose a parent as a young child, it has a tremendous impact. It leaves a gigantic hole in your life that is with you your entire life. This particular relationship position is monumentally powerful in the lives of the people that it impacts, the children. So it's very, very serious in terms of a commandment. It's a commandment that must not be overlooked. We have a tremendous responsibility as parents to raise up our children in discipline and instruction, and to learn. And if you didn't have parents who did this with you, if they weren't very good at that, well, you have a responsibility to get better. You may not be perfect. None of us really are, but you have a responsibility to grow in that and to learn and to get better at it for the sake of your children. And then hopefully by the time you have grandchildren, you'll be really good at it, and you can help your children out by helping to raise the grandchildren in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So what I want to do now is we're going to record a few of these is for some, whoever wants to share the impact, and I want to do positive. I don't want to do negative. Positive impact of a father or a father figure, because in some cases you may have had a stepfather, for instance, who really was your father. It could be that you didn't have a father. Maybe you were raised by a single mom. You didn't have a father, but maybe you had an uncle or a family friend, or maybe it was a pastor or, an older brother or something like that who stepped in and would serve as a father figure. And certainly it's a valuable thing to do for someone. If you know a child that doesn't have a father and you have the ability to be a father figure for them, I believe that's an important thing to do. And it's a thing that I believe the Lord is going to reward us for, that it's something that he would be very pleasing to God if you have the ability to step in and be a father figure for someone who doesn't have a father or doesn't have a good father figure. So I'll start off, and then whoever would like to share, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. We'll do a few on the recording, then we'll stop the recording, and anybody else who wants to share after the recording, we'll keep going. So the thing that I wanted to share from my father, my father was at home the whole time that I was growing up, and the thing that really one of the things that really stuck with me in a real positive way was he was a very good disciplinarian. If something happened to cause him to lose his temper, for instance, even if he was really angry, he would find a way to redirect that away from me and my brother, and would not he wouldn't take it out on us, kind of thing, right? Even if it was something that we had caused. I remember we were having a snowball fight one time, and I threw a chunk of ice at him instead of a snowball, and I hit him in the head with it, and it obviously hurt a lot, and he was obviously very angry, but he just really maintained his cool through that. But when he would go to discipline us, he had this approach that was very calm. It was methodical. He didn't lose his temper when he had to discipline us. Even if we were really, being out of line, he would sit us down. He would talk to us calmly, but it was you felt like you were in front of a judge in a courtroom, and he treated it very seriously, but in this really positive way, making sure that we understood why were we being punished, what his expectation was, what we had done that failed to meet up to his expectation. And it really stuck with me throughout my childhood and into adulthood, and with my own children. And because he had trained me up that way, I was able to do that with my children, where I could be that. And I think if you talk to my children, they would tell you stories about that, where when it came time to discipline them for doing something wrong, that I carried out the lessons of my father in my approach to that. And I've always really, really appreciated that. I see a lot of times parents, they go to their kids are completely out of line. Maybe they're throwing a fit in the middle of a store and they're losing it, and the parents are losing it and stuff like that. And my dad just didn't do that. And I learned, not to do that. So it was really positive. influence that my dad had on me in that particular way. Okay, who'd like to share next?
I will, John.
Go for it, Donna.
I had an uncle that was very prominent in my life, and I lived with him and his wife. They were childless. She couldn't have any children. She later adopted two girls who were sisters, but I was the golden child, even though I had an earthly father. This uncle demonstrated God's love. He also was a Christian, and he would take me. I was very fearful, very timid child. I had a lot of things, that weren't one thriving very well, kind of puny and little and, premature. And so there was consequences that came with being premature baby. But he took me in his motorboat with his wife, and they were the calmest, coolest. I mean, we're out in the middle of the ocean, and this guy, he also was a fireman. He was very popular in the community. Lots of people love this guy. His personality was Mr. Wonderful. And the boat capsized. And of course, they had things on us, floaters and stuff, and his two adopted daughters. And I was very tiny. I was scared to death of water. And he would hold me. And I can't tell you the times that this man came into my life at crucial points of desperation in and out of my life, who whisked me away in his arms and did things. He also was a medic. He had many talents, and he saved my life twice. One time I stopped breathing. I don't know what was going on with me, and he rescued me. And this guy was, to me, Jesus. He was so aware of me and so attentive and so gentle, even in the middle of capsizing his boat. He was a very astute man, very learned kind of guy. And he didn't panic at all. He just got the boat back up, plopped us all back in there, his wife too. She was very cool. And I learned to stop being afraid of everything. And I can remember his embrace and how it made me feel, in that, tragic scene of tragedy that it kept coming in and out many, many times. I believe the Lord used him because of his gracious personality. And he just taught me that I was loved. He was the father figure of all father figures to me, where if I would say, did I see God in a man, he would be the number one person that would come up for me in memory time after time. A wonderful, wonderful heart, wonderful love for God and people. He had all that going on.
That's really wonderful, Donna. It's really good to have, somebody like that. If it's your own, biological father, or somebody like your uncle steps in and fulfills that role. Every child needs that example that you just described of your uncle. Pereiras.
Yes. Uh, One of the big things that I learned, from my father was like how much he once like disciplined me because I stole something, from my school, and I was be like in the 5th grade, and I found something like I was so excited about, it was like a compass box basically, and I bought it home. So, but my father was so mad, and he was not so cool, I think, the way you described your dad, but he was so mad, and he gave like a big whipping, to me. But that, like, I really learned how wrong, stealing is, and that helped me. I never did that. You know, I never stole after that, because I just, those image come into my mind, how much my father hated stealing. So yeah, that's one big thing that I remember and I learned from my father.
That's an
Yeah.
important lesson.
Yes.
Seema, did you want to share? Or?
Yes. I want to share about my father. So my father means what I remember his image as a very firm man. He knew what he wants to do and he had to do, and he would not waver from that. He was a judge, and he knew that he has to be righteous and he should not bring, like he was very careful what judgment he gives on people, because he didn't want to be judge anyone wrongly. So he said when he would go on the dais, before that he would just, they have to like show respect towards the dais and go, and he said he would pray at that time, God please give me wisdom and guide me in what I say. And there were many times he was offered bribes, but he wouldn't take it. And he's firm believer that if he would have taken bribes and he would have changed his ways, that though that curse would have come on us. And he said, I want my children to be blessed and I would never do that. So that has remained with me.
That's really, really, really cool, Seema. What a great example for you and your siblings. Paul's got his hand up.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, my dad, I mean, growing up, he was and he still is a Christian. And I just remember that. I mean, he was a humble man and he was very fair to others in all his dealings. And when we were growing up, I mean, looking at the verse that you shared there about in Ephesians 6:4, about bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. I mean, it was really tough growing up in our house, not as in really disciplined, although there was, of course, discipline, but just that in all the ways to the outside world as well, we were keeping separate from the world, being separate, and living that life. And it was obviously very different from how many others around us would live, you know, who would have anything that they wanted and do anything they wanted. And there were boundaries for us. We couldn't do all of those things. And that was really tough growing up. And I think at some point, I resisted that. And when I was 13, I went away from the Lord, and obviously didn't come back until a long, long time after that. But I always had that image of my father with the fairness and the humbleness, and he was not a hypocrite in any way, which was really quite something, something that in my experience is very rare. And I've just had that, I've always had that picture in my life. And I believe that when God called me, because I had that picture in my life and that shining light, I think that God was pushing against an open door. So, and I hope that I've got some of those qualities for myself. Some of those have rubbed off. If just a little bit, I'd be very grateful for that. Yeah, that's my father.
I've read several biographies of Scottish Christians, and I can't remember. There was a Scottish missionary to the New Hebrides Islands in the 1800s. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's a really good book. It's really just a really interesting life. And
We're not talking about Wigglesworth, were you?
No.
He's English.
No. This was a Scottish guy, and he was a missionary. The New Hebrides Islands at the time had several missionaries had tried to go there and failed because they were cannibals, and he was able to go in and bring the gospel to the tribes in those islands, and was successful and lived the rest of his life there. But the beginning of the book talks about his Scottish father, and his father was just really, he was just he wasn't a pastor or anything like that, but he was really, really great man of God. And I'll never forget reading about when he would talk about his father would go into a prayer closet and he would wrestle with God, like literally. He said it was like he'd be crying out in there and he'd hear banging in there and stuff like that. And he and his brothers and sisters would sit outside the door just listening to his prayers and his calling out to God. And this would go on for an hour or two in his prayer closet. And it had such a deep, deep impact on him and his siblings. It's really, really, really good. So that's cool, Paul. Josiah over here has something he wants to share. So I'm going to turn the camera on you.
Oh yeah, you did say you're gonna change the camera. So my dad has definitely instilled in me by example and by just training a real care for the Word of God. And I remember different things I'd do if I stole or lied. He'd make me go find like 30 verses about that subject, about why not to do it, why it's bad. Like he let me use the computer and stuff like that. But yeah, we never really got real deep theologically until recently, when I made a lot of changes. We disagreed pretty stiffly on a lot of theological things, but he really was super focused on practical application of the Bible, and that really meant a lot to me. Always tried to bring us up right. I know every parent has regrets of how they did things, but and then he's always focused on helping other people too. They're very, very focused on helping people have good marriages and bring up their children right. And they even their car dealership is totally, I mean, he's totally focused on giving people books and counseling people if they want it, and just all day every day, that's what he does. So that I look back on kind of my tendencies and I can really see I got a lot of them from him, even though I surface level disagree with him on a lot of things, and I always feel that like there's some friction when we're around each other. But when I actually look back, he's a pretty awesome dad. So yeah, that's what I got.
That's cool. Very good. Anybody else before we end the recording, and then we'll continue? Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording. If you're listening to this, we'd love to have you join us. Find us on the web at allegiancetotheking.org. You can contact us there, or on Facebook. You can find us at our Facebook page, which is Christian Virtual Fellowship. You probably know this if you're watching this, but the YouTube channel is Christian Virtual Fellowship. So we'd love to have you join us. And it doesn't matter where you are. You can see there's people from India and Poland and Norway and the UK and all over the place. So and Philippines, doesn't really matter where you are. Come and join us.